For today's lab, we're going to be going over the muscular system and movements around the body. And so we start off with those movements, and one of the easiest ways to learn these actions is to learn it in the arms first. So when you think about the word flexion, flexion will imply that you are curling your fingers, right? Like this is flexion, and the opposite is extension, going straight like this. And so you'll see that a lot of your joints actually are capable of doing that motion. The fingers first, flexion, and then the wrist can as well, flexion, and then you can see the elbow as well, flexion, and then you can see the shoulder, flexion. And so the opposite is true, extension, extension, and then extension, and finally extension. And so flexion becomes like curling a rug, and then extension is like undoing that rug. And so that's essentially what flexion is. So the shoulder becomes the toughest one, and you want to think about doing this. When you go forward, this is flexion. This, doing a jumping jack motion, is something else. And so we don't care about this one right now. We care about the one going forward. This is flexion, and bringing it down is extension. And you can all kind of guess that if this is flexion, then this is extension, and then this would be what if I keep going this way? Hyperextension. And so hyperextension, extension, flexion. And so that's the general motion behind a lot of these joints. Is that flexion, typically you can see her shoulder joint is the one that's elevating up. It's kind of like raising both of your hands to answer a question in a classroom. And you can see flexion also means the bending of a joint. So that's the same motion that she technically could do if she were to bend her elbow. She could bend her knee, and then this leg can go back. This is flexion because she's creating this angle, flexion. And if she brought it back, it would be extension. And so you can see that's the very diagram, what it's trying to show. Extension, bringing that knee back. And then you can see her shoulder went up, flexion, and then she brought it back down, or if you go in the opposite direction, it's going to be extension. If you go to where she's made it, hyperextension. Here where she's at, extension. And you can do this also for the neck. The neck, if you nod yes or down to look down at the ground, that is flexion. And when you look up to the sky, that is extension. But again, flexion will always be some sort of curling, decreasing some angle. And so this is kind of the case in this one. And the other one's probably going to be increasing. But otherwise, flexion is like going down. Extension is going to be looking up. You can also do it for your vertebral column. If you imagine your vertebral column, your vertebra, your cervical, your thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions, right? All of them are capable of bending. You have those intervertebral discs, and they allow for a bending. So if you wanted to pick something off the ground, your ability to bend your abdominal area, right, your vertebra really, is called flexion, your ability to touch your toes. And then when you go back up in a regular erect manner, you go to you're extended or undergoing extension. And then if you go further back and sort of are lean and tipping over backwards a little bit, then it's hyperextension. But overall, flexion and extension are words that exist with each other. They mean the opposite of each other. And then when we look at movements, here, these movements are a little bit different. If you draw a little circle in the air, that's going to be circumduction. And now abduction and adduction. Now these words do require the camera because they look eerily similar to what we just learned. When we saw this one, this was flexion, raising both hands to answer a question in class. But when we think about abduction and adduction, that's going to be now the jumping jack motion. It's the same thing, but to the sides. That's the difference. So going up is abduction, ABD, abduction, and then adduction, ADD, is to go all the way back down. So jumping jack, ABD, ADD, abduction, and then this one is adduction. And remember this, try to remember adding, like ADD, you're adding it to your body, adduction and ABD. Another easier way of remembering that too is that the one that goes upwards, abduction, starts with a B, right? B is in alphabetical order. By comparison, it's first before D. And so B is at the top, superior, when it's going up. And then when it's going down, adduction, or again, once it's going towards your body. And so again, I just like to think about jumping jacks when I think about these two motions. Going up is abduction with a B, and then adduction with a D. bringing it down to your body. And then we have rotation. This one's a little bit simpler to understand. You have your C1 and your C2 that allow for some axis rotation. And so this ability to look left, to look right, that's called rotation around the neck. You can see that even your limbs are capable of doing some rotation. And one of the easier ways to sort of think about this is sort of think about if you keep your hands out like this and then you bring them in like for a hug, this is medial rotation to the midline, and then lateral rotation is opening them out. And so typically it's depicted like this, medial rotation, lateral rotation. But it's always just easier to imagine a hug, and it's the same exact motion. Medial rotation and lateral rotation. Medial, you're closing the hug. Lateral, you're opening the hug. She does it with her straight arms here, which make it a little more complicated, I think. But I think just imagining hugging someone is medial rotation, and then opening it, that hug is lateral rotation. And then this ulna and this radius are capable of doing some rotation, like along just the forearm or the antebrachial region. And so if you're flipping over, like flipping something over, like flipping over a tortilla, flipping over a pancake, anything, that motion of just flipping is pronation and supination. Pronation is when you actually rotate over and you have the back of your hand showing forward or showing anterior, anatomical position. But if you go back to the regular position, an anatomical position, you are supinated. So just being in anatomical position is supination, and if you just flip it over, it's going to be pronation, the opposite of that. Next, we have inversion and eversion. Inversion is when you try to make both of your toes touch each other. I can't really show you that on the camera, but if you look down at your toes and you make them touch each other, like kind of make your big toes kiss each other in a way, inversion, right? Inversion, they're going in to the midline. Eversion is like going away, like to evade, and so it's going to be making your toes face away from each other. It's kind of like they don't want to be next to each other anymore. Eversion. And then we have more flexion, but these become a little bit easier because we know that the bottom of the foot is plantar region. And so if you are going down towards it, you are doing plantar flexion. If you go in the opposite direction, it's dorsiflexion. The word dorsi typically implies kind of like the back of the hand. Even on the hand itself, like the knuckle part is called dorsum, and so that's where this word comes from, because even your foot has the plantar region and it has sort of the knuckle part, right? This is the part that you kick with if you're like in a fighting sport, and it's kind of like the punching equivalent of your knuckle. And so when you go towards that direction, it's called dorsiflexion when you go in that direction. And even easier, if you're driving and you push down on the gas, plantar flexion. If you let go of the gas, dorsiflexion. Next, when we look at skeletal muscle, remember that we learned these muscles already technically as a tissue. We saw skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Cardiac was found in the heart and is not a topic for today, but it's a topic when we come back 2 weeks from now, we go over the cardiovascular system, and you're going to see, then we go over it. And smooth was found in hollow organs and in digestive tract, but it's not really relevant either for today. But for the most part, they function identical with their sarcomeres and the calcium and that cross-bridge formation. They have the same functions within that muscle tissue. The skeletal muscle, though, is what we're really focusing on. And these always, on a microscope, look like large cylinders. They can be up to 30 centimeters in length. And I really want you to imagine what that means. Those cuboidal cells is an example that you learned about. By comparison, they're this big. If you look at just one cell with all its organelles that we've been learning about, epithelial cells, maybe even a little osteocyte or an osteoblast living in its lacuna, probably about that big. But when you compare it to a muscle cell, we're not even done looking at it here. This is the entire length of one cell just right now, and we're not even finished seeing it. This can, again, be 30 centimeters in length. And if any of you haven't taken any chemistry or metrics classes, just thinking about the size, this is like in micrometers. That's how small this is. It's a millionth of a meter. That's how easy it is, or how small these things are, cells are. But these things, these cells can be 30 centimeters. That means that you can visually, technically see it. And so you may not even need a microscope to see a full fiber. And so that's how insanely large skeletal muscles are compared to all the regular cells that you've been learning about. But remember that these are cells just like any other. They have nuclei, they have ER, right, rough and smooth endoplasmic reticulums. They have plasma membranes, but they're just typically called something else. And they're so large that they require another nucleus. They require more than one nuclei because they need to do a lot of protein synthesis, and the nucleus is what directs protein synthesis. So they end up needing a lot more nuclei. For the lab, you just need to be able to recognize this tissue and know it's skeletal muscle, and then recognize these lines like in that first lab exam. These are striations. That's what makes skeletal muscle unique, are these striations. It's a unique pattern of the sarcomeres inside. And the function of this tissue is that it provides your voluntary movement of the body. You control it, that's what this means. And this means that you have a will over things, right? Because whenever you want to accomplish anything, you have to move towards it. Whether it's to study, you still have to open books. You're going to need the muscles in your arms to do so. And so you can manipulate the environment or exact your will on the external environment. And then also for expressions, right? Like we use it as human beings to show or hide emotions, right? We wear them on our face or we hide them on our face. And so this is what the actual slide looks like, the one that we have in lab. And so you more than likely just want to use this picture because I'm going to have these printouts. And so this is what skeletal muscle looks like. It has those patterns, those striations. Typically, cardiac muscle has striations too. If you look very closely, you can see them very ever so slightly right about here. And so you can see that it's just consistent throughout. Like there's just these lines, these pinstripes there. Very, very, very hard to see, but they're there. And so they're not as perfectly cylindrical as skeletal muscle, and that's usually the dead giveaway, is that they look more fibrous, especially on your slides. But most of the time, they just have more branching. That's typically how you can tell. And I guess that's kind of what we're seeing are these little extracellular, like, I don't know really, they're like, I'm not really sure what these are, to be sincerely honest. When I saw these microscope slides, they don't really look like what I thought cardiac tissue should look like. Typically, they look kind of like this, but they have more branching, and they look kind of eerily similar. But this one, you can see it looks very clear. It must be a certain segment they use. It still has some fibrous tissue because this is not part of the cardiac muscle cell. This looks like fibers, so who knows where they got it from. But otherwise, that's typically going to be the big giveaway, is that the skeletal muscle is going to be much more cylindrical. It's much more cylindrical than your cardiac muscle. And then smooth, you can always see the nuclei are going to be much more flattened than in the other ones. They're going to be longer than in the other ones, and they do not have striations. They do not have those zebra pinstripes on their cells. And so now we actually get into the muscles. And so the tissues, you just have to be able to recognize these three, know the function of skeletal. Cardiac is coming up in 3 weeks, and we'll discuss that function then. Smooth doesn't come up till a little bit later, but you just have to know what it looks like on a slide. So as we move on, now we get into the fun part, is that a lot of this is going to be based off of all those bone markings that we learned about. As you learned about bones and you learned about all those very unique structures that each one of those bones have, the reason we have to torture you with them in anatomy is because there are muscles that are attached to those bones. And so at times, those bones have bone markings or structures that are dedicated to making sure that those muscles stay attached. So as you look at this head now, there's some muscles that are located next to the bones that you've learned about earlier. You have your temporal bone, right, that had the little ear hole, the external acoustic meatus. And so the muscle that sits right on top of that temporal bone is called the temporalis. And it has the ability, or its function in the body, is to allow for the elevation of your mandible. It is connected up here. Can you imagine that it connects to your mandible? Your mandible is all the way down here. And so you can see that it has tendon connections all the way to the mandible. And so when it contracts, when those sarcomeres contract, this segment that's going to be attached to the mandible, probably a little bit closer to the mandibular head, when it elevates it up, it brings it up to elevate that entire bone completely up. And so it's always going to be heading in this direction. And this leads me to my next point. Something that you do not need to know for our lab, but it's useful to know, is that there's something called origins and insertions. And I'm going to do my best to draw it in. I'm going to put origin, and I'm going to do this, a straight line. And then I'm going to do insertion, which is typically denoted by white a lot of the times in these, insertion. And I'm going to call this point B, and this origin point A. And the reason this matters is because the rule of muscles is that an insertion will always move towards an origin. So this segment here is connected to your mandible. Therefore, if it's connected to your mandible, you can see that it's connected entirely to this region, so it has the ability to move the mandible upwards in any one of these directions, because again, the insertion goes towards the origin. And you can see that the origin is just always going to be simply anchoring point, or an anchor. And so only the insertion moves, and it moves towards the origin. That's it. And so this mandible is always being raised towards this origin. Another example that's going to look very similar, and it's right next door, is this other muscle called the masseter. It's this other one next door, underneath, inferior to the temporalis, this little rectangular one there. And this masseter is, you can see that it's going to have some insertions and some origins also in the mandible. And so it has some insertions down here, and it has origins up here. And you don't need to know the origins and insertions, but just visualize this very thing here, that the insertion travels up towards the origin. And so when these sarcomeres contract, they bring whatever this is attached to, which is going to be the mandible. It's going to bring the mandible straight up for that chewing motion. And so you can see that its action is closing the jaw. And so understanding origins and insertions makes muscles easier to understand, because you always just have to visualize, for most muscles that are not circular, that the insertion, or it's always going to go from point A to point B. It's going to move one side of the muscle to the other side. It's going to move the insertion to the origin. And so for our lab exam in this class, you just will be asked on a model. They're just going to ask you a term, and then they're going to say, what does it do? That's the basis of the entire exam. And so that's pretty much what we're going to focus on for these slides. And so we start off with temporalis, named after temporal bone, temporalis. Be careful, temporal muscle sometimes I feel is what students want to call it, but temporalis. Masseter, think of the word mastication. That means to chew, and so closes jaw. Masseter is going to be this square rectangular one that you see in that particular region. Next, we have our sternocleidomastoid, which is a combination of a few terms. Sterno for sternum, cleido for clavicle, mastoid for the mastoid process of the temporal bone. And that's because this bone connects to the sternum, connects to the clavicle. And if we zoom in on this picture, you can see that it's a doubled ribboned muscle in a way, that it has two segments to it. That's the first part. And then here's the second part right there. So let's do this. Second part here. And then our first part here. And so these two together make up the sternocleidomastoid. You can even see it connects to the sternum, it connects to the clavicle, and it connects to something on the temporal bone up above called the mastoid process. Actually, more precisely, if you want to feel it, feel the back of your ear, that bump that's right behind your ear, that's your mastoid process. So this muscle connects all the way from your clavicle all the way to your mastoid process. And this is going to be responsible for flexion. So even as we look at my camera here, you can see that this muscle, it connects back here to the mastoid process, all the way down here to the sternum and the clavicle. Imagine the length of this muscle. You know when you've been on your phone all day And then you get that stiff neck and you're like, you feel it like this. That's because that muscle is responsible for always doing this motion. The insertion is up here, the origin is down here. And so when it wants to move your skull, it moves the insertion to your origin. So what happens when this muscle squeezes or contracts? It brings your head down this way. So it brings it down. The insertion moves towards the origin, so it brings it down. And so that's kind of the action of this particular muscle, is that it flexes the head, or it causes that bend in the head. Again, flexion is like looking down at the ground with your head. Extension is looking at the sky with your head, with your eyes, all together, moving together. And so, bless you. And so that's what this muscle is for, the sternocleidomastoid. There's another one called the smiling muscle, called the zygomaticus, named after the zygomatic bone. And so it's connected to your cheekbones, and it's two bands of muscles. One's the major, one's the minor. But in this lab, I'll point to both of them. You should just know them as a pair, zygomaticus. And its function is to smile, to smile. This is the one that if you overuse it, you get dimples because you get a wrinkle in your skin. That's what a dimple is, because you use it so much because you're always smiling. And its insertions are going to be on the lips or on the corner of the lips. And it's going to have origins up here. So the insertion, when you smile, these muscles contract and it brings the insertion to the origin. And that's how you create that smiling face shape with the lips. They go up. And so their job is to raise the lateral corners of the mouth, or more simply, for smiling. You can just say smiling. Buccinator is going to be a word based off of the word buccal. Remember that buccal is a word that means cheek. And so buccinator is going to refer to that cheek area. And this is why you can actually pull liquid out of a straw. You can pull out of a straw and create that pressure, that sucking motion, because you can compress your cheek with these muscles. And so that's called the buccinator. And so this is going to be the deepest muscle. You'll have three to look for here. You have one connected to the zygomatic bone, zygomaticus. You'll have another one that looks rectangular. That's going to be our masseter. But underneath it, the deepest muscle is going to be the buccinator. Next, we have our orbicularis oris, and the orbicularis oris is going to be this circular muscle, and it's going to be considered a sphincter because it guards the entryway into your body. And so it's circular in nature. Right now, we're only seeing half of that circle. We'll see it from the front in a second. But otherwise, this is responsible for closing your mouth. That's it, closing your mouth. Purse's lips. Purse's lips can also, I believe, mean to sort of like pucker your lower cheek forward, but I think that the safest and easiest definition is that it closes the mouth. Closes the mouth. And I'm going to add that into our notes. You can write, as students, either one. Closes mouth. Cool. And then with that, orbicularis, right? Orbital, right? That's kind of where it's coming from. Or actually more like, and sounded like ocular, right? So orbicularis, sort of implying the eye, and then oral. And actually this overall is implying the shape, like orbit, like circular. And so orbicularis oris. This is a play off of the word oral, oral. And the reason I'm taking my time with this is because if you look up here, orbicularis, meaning circular again in nature, and then oculi to imply ocular. And so be careful with that, because we might want to think this means regarding the eye. But most of all, this just means circular. This is telling you where it's at. Ocular is the eye, and then oris is the mouth for oral. And so you can see it does the same thing, closes the eye. That's why it's kind of nice to learn these two together. And now this is the lateral aspect, or muscles of head and the face. So we're going to have to progress a little bit further. This is a picture of the model that we have for the facial muscles. So they're labeled there for you. And so these will be in here in the lab, and probably a little bit later in a bit. Or also they'll be here next lab, so that you can all you have to do is do a little scavenger hunt, be able to identify. And that's really the goal this week, is that you want to go home, learn them on a diagram, know their spelling, come into lab, and just make sure you can identify them on the model. And then that's really the hardest part about this task, is just learning it on a diagram, taking that time, and then doing the scavenger hunt of using the models. Because remember, this is your test question as you're looking at it right now. This is exactly how they'll ask you. I'll ask you. They'll point to the model. We'll ask for what is the name of that muscle, or they're going to ask you what is the action. And so you're either selecting the muscle name out of the word bank, or you are selecting the muscle action out of the word bank. But you never know what they're going to ask you, right? They're going to say, pick the action out of the word bank. And then they're going to say, now you write the muscle name, right? They might do it backwards. So you have to know this diagram back and forth. You have to know the name of the muscle and then what does it do? Or if I ask you, which muscle closes the eye, you should be able to answer backwards, orbicularis oculi. And so you can see this is not as bad. This is going to be sort of reminiscent as learning the bones, but I think it's not as crazy as the bones. The bones, there's a lot going on in the bones. And so with that, we move on to our next segment, which is going to be our thoracic region and the shoulder region. And so these are pretty popular muscles. A lot of us have heard the word pecs, like where the people are working out their pecs. And that's typically in reference to the chest area. And so the chest area has two muscles, pectoralis major. This is the aesthetic one that all the bodybuilders, the glory muscles, everyone's trying to work out this one. And then underneath, a little unknown to a lot of us, is that there's an important muscle involved in the movement of that scapula that we tested on last week. This pectoralis minor sits underneath the pectoralis major. When you look at these diagrams, right, you have to draw your eyes to what you know. Sternum bone, you know that these are the ribs. You know that this is the clavicle. And then you know there's a scapula back there connected to that clavicle. You have your humerus bone, and something to draw your eyes to now is that most muscle diagrams have some sort of superficial aspect, and then they remove stuff, and then you can see underneath it. So this would be a deep aspect. And now you're seeing our words being used, superficial muscle and deeper muscle, because these are going to sit underneath this one, so deeper. And so this side, or both sides, have a pectoralis major. They remove it out of this side so you can see the pectoralis minor. And the pectoralis major, what it does is that it does arm flexion. And we learned that arm flexion is raising your hands. It's like raising your hands in a classroom. That's what arm flexion is. Or also leaning in for a hug. You'll even notice that, I'm going to show you on the camera here, that when we do flexion, again, just as a quick reminder, I hope it's still screen recording. When we do flexion, it's like raising your hands above flexion. And then if you wanted to work out your chest, what do you see? You see some individuals do this. It kind of works out your shoulders a little more because shoulders take over this muscle more. But it does work out your chest. And what other one do? They do this. Again, they're going in for the hug, medial rotation. And then lateral rotation is letting go of that hug. So that muscle has two functions. This chest muscle, think about those flies. They work it out by flying or hugging, right? They're hugging and they're holding on to some weight. And so this is pectoralis major. And then again, hugging, or again, a lateral arm flexion. And so with that, yes, it's still recording. And so that's what that muscle does. You'll see the deltoid. This one simply does abduction. That means that instead of it raising your hands in class, you're going to the sides, doing lateral raises. And that is like, again, jumping jacks, doing the up part of your jumping jack, A, B, D, going up. And then the opposite of that, right? Because it wouldn't be complete to not, you need to talk about a muscle that does the opposite, right? Because we may think that as you do abduction, that your arm, right, that's just one motion. Like you might think that, oh, you're only doing this, abduction, and this is letting go, but that's far from the truth. You actually do abduction with the deltoid muscle. This muscle, when it contracts, on our humerus bone, there was this bump called the deltoid tuberosity. And so there's a muscle that sits right here called the deltoid. And its insertions are where my fingers are, and its origins are going to be all over the clavicle and the scapula. And so insertions go towards the origin. And so when that happens, when this muscle contracts, it does what we just described, the abduction, ABD, abduction, right? It contracts and it brings that humerus bone. But now, to bring it down, this muscle needs to sort of chill, it needs to relax, and so this can happen. But more than that, there's a muscle down here that's pulling and attached to the humerus bone, and it pulls down from this side. So even this is an action. It's not letting go. This isn't letting go isn't an action, but muscles bring this down if I want it to come down. And so they also bring it up from this side. Bring it down. And it's the same for the neck, everything. These muscles, even the one that we just learned about, lateral flexes the neck, sternocleidomastoid, brings it down. And there's going to be muscles in the back that are going to bring it back up to the opposite. So there's always going to be some sort of opposite interaction. Even as you look at the limb, this muscle at the top, when the bicep, is going to bring this joint this way. And then this one's going to pull from this direction, bringing it to the other side, because these muscles are attached to this part. They're attached on this side for this muscle. This side is attached to this muscle, and so they're always at tug of war. This one pulls from this side, this one pulls from this side. When you look at our models now, you'll see that when you look at it with tendons, you can see that if you follow any one of these muscles, and again, this is the arm, just a generic arm, and you can see that there is muscles at the top, that as you look at it, you can see that the tendons go and connect to this region, so when this squeezes, it brings and does this motion. And the opposite is true, that the tricep in the back, it's missing a little segment here, but it goes all the way down and it connects to this, and so when the back pulls, it's like pulling from the opposite, making this motion. And so that's true for the entire limb, which is pretty good news as far as like learning the rest of the muscles, because that's really all it comes down to, is that there's some sort of tug of war. And so if you know the word abduction, you know there's going to be a muscle that's going to have to adduct it. And so I am looking for that particular muscle, but it seems to me that you actually don't even need a muscle that adducts on your list. And I think that you do not have it even on this other part. Sorry, technical difficulties. 1 sec. Let me double check these notes. And you do. But they don't show it or just label it for you as such. Okay, then I'll add it. All right, so as we go on, now these muscles are in the front of the body. And what I was looking for was a muscle that does the opposite action, bringing that arm adduction, but I don't see any actual terms that they included to let you, to test you on. But otherwise, I will probably add one myself. And so here, as we look at now our trapezius is going to be this segment here, which is going to be this large back muscle. It's our largest back muscle. And this is going to be able to rotate the scapula. And this does a few things, actually. This actually does the opposite. It also does neck extension, which I'm also going to add. And on the exam, you pick one definition. Like if it asks you for the action, I want you to pick the one that you will remember the best. And so extension of the neck. And the reason I like this term better than rotates the scapula is because you can pair it with your sternocleidomastoid. The one that we previously saw, because this sternocleidomastoid does flexion of the head. That means that it makes you look down at the ground, and then this trapezius does the opposite. So you can always remember these as a pair, because this will do extension of the neck, and then the sternocleidomastoid does flexion of the neck. It does the opposite. So it's kind of nice to pair them by their actions sometimes. With that, we move on to our latissimus dorsi. This is going to do arm extension. And so you can see you can pair this one with your pectoralis major, because pectoralis major does arm flexion, raising your hand in class. And then arm extension is bringing your hand down because you got your question answered or you put it down. Arm extension. And so that is done by the latissimus dorsi, which is this large muscle, which is commonly called the lats. And so this is the latissimus dorsi, and it is the opposite of the pectoralis major. Supraspinatus now and infraspinatus. These should be logically easy to understand. Supra runs above the spine of the scapula, supraspinatus. Infraspinatus is this large muscle that runs underneath the spine, and they do different things even though they are located in the same areas. And for example, infraspinatus can do lateral arm rotation. Supraspinatus does medial elevation. It actually abducts with the deltoid. It helps it. But this is probably the easiest one since they sound alike. Stabilizes shoulder. And so these two muscles are also part of what you might have heard before as a rotator cuff. A rotator cuff is made out of 4 muscles that stabilize your shoulder joint so that it can rotate and not pop out of its socket. Typically, if you have injuries on your shoulder joint, what a lot of physical therapy is based off of is strengthening these muscles by adding weight and doing these motions, like supraspinatus does lateral, like it does a lateral extension like this, abduction in a way. And so if you wanted to stabilize your supraspinatus, then they add weight and then you do this. And then it makes the muscle stronger. And so that way you don't actually, the muscles stabilize the joint and it doesn't pop out or whatever could have been the issue. But otherwise, this is called a rotator cuff muscle because it stabilizes the shoulder. And it tends to be easy to remember supraspinatus and infraspinatus for that very fact. And so stabilizes shoulder is the best action, I think, to hold on to going into this exam. Or if you want to pair it with the muscle with the opposite action, infraspinatus does lateral arm rotation, opening that hug, letting go of the hug. And then the opposite of that was medial rotation. So you see pectoralis major can be kind of paired by their opposite action with 2 muscles. But otherwise, I'll leave it up to you. But I think personally, just having one, just kind of learning them individually might be best, or pairing them by their exact or the opposite action is. Like that. Arm extension, arm flexion. And then lastly, underneath that infraspinatus, we have our teres major, which is going to do arm extension. It's actually going to assist the latissimus dorsi in doing the same thing. So you can see even the latissimus dorsi and the teres major are both going to be connected to the humerus bone. If we look at the latissimus dorsi, it's connected there. If we look at the teres major, it's connected on the humerus bone. And so you can see when necessary, it'll bring that humerus bone down. It'll bring that humerus bone down. So their job is to bring the hand down after you raised it up. Arm extension. And on your actual notes, keep in mind the deltoid is this huge muscle. Anything on the shoulder, deltoid. Trapezius is going to be anterior and it's going to be very large. Typically that's better shown from the back. You're seeing it right here, the trapezius, the trap muscles that you might hear sometimes being called. And then right underneath it, they go in order. And that's always the nice thing about this is that if you start at the back, it's trapezius, infraspinatus, and teres major. You cannot see the supraspinatus on this model. You cannot see it on that model. And so I put that note down here. And that's because it sits underneath the trapezius. And next week I'll let you know where we can ask this because I'm not quite sure yet. And then here we have the pectoralis minor. That's going to be the one that's individually connected to the rib cage. And the pectoralis major sits on top of it. And we're going to have to rely on another model for that one here. Because we have to put on something on top of it, or do you see it from a different perspective? Here you can see this is going to be the pectoralis major, and the minor is located in that same area. But it's just these that go to the rib, the minor, meaning smaller. Deltoid, trapezius, and that's really it. Here's another close-up view of the same muscles, deltoid, trapezius. Latissimus dorsi is the only one I wasn't able to really show you on the other one because we dropped the picture. And so you can see latissimus dorsi. But there's an order to them. Deltoid, infraspinatus, teres major, latissimus dorsi, from superior to inferior. 4 terms on that segment. And then above our scapula, or so you're going to see the top portion of our trapezius. And this muscle normally would be covering all of this completely. It is the most superficial muscle on in the entire back. It really does look like this through the entire back. It covers up these muscles as well. And so you can see that our model is showing that very thing. The reason we can't see the supraspinatus is because it sits underneath this trapezius. You have to get this out of the way in order to see it. And this is another perspective where now if you remove the trapezius, if the trapezius is gone, you can see that on top of the scapula, there sits the supraspinatus. And so again, you're looking at this side with the trapezius. It's now removed on this side. So you can look down at the top of the spine and you can see our supraspinatus, and that's what we're seeing here. And next, these are other views again of that rotator cuff in case. And so the infraspinatus is going to be below that spine, below the spine. The teres major is going to be this band that reaches for the humerus bone. And the latissimus dorsi is going to be this large one, this large broad sheet that goes all the way almost to your waistline. And so be careful because it's easy to confuse teres major from latissimus dorsi. And so if you look at teres major individually by itself, you'll see that it looks like a cylinder underneath it. And so that's how you always know you're looking at it. It looks like a sausage link, and it's kind of connected to your humerus bone. It doesn't look that apparent here, but you can kind of see that sausage link reaching for that direction. And so this would be your teres major, sitting above your latissimus dorsi. And that's what we're seeing here. And so this is your arm models now, and you'll see that the deltoid is this pyramid-shaped muscle. It's going to have different directions for different bands. What's what I'm looking for? Bundles of muscle fibers going in different directions because it actually is pretty multifaceted. It does allow for different types of raising of the arm. And so the deltoid is going to be that large apparent one there. Supraspinatus, again, find the spine. That's the key. The muscle above, supraspinatus. The muscle below, the large grouped ones here, are going to be infraspinatus. Infraspinatus will always be 3 muscle bands like this. And for us, all of them, these that are here. All the way until you reach this little nubby one, this number here, 5. You can see that there's no number on these, but if there was, there would be a 3 on them. 3 and a 3, like this. And so for us, for our exam, anything that's asked on this portion, infraspinatus. Infra. And teres major, again, always sits underneath that infraspinatus, and it sits above the latissimus dorsi, slightly above. And so this is your teres major, right underneath. All right, we move on from there. Now, as we look at our rib cage, your rib cage has muscles that are dedicated to elevation and depression, meaning to pick them up and drop them. And so your lungs exist inside of this rib cage, and these muscles assist with breathing. If anything, they're the reason you can breathe. There's one on the outside called external, one on the inside. The word inter means in between. Costals means rib cage, so this means in between the rib cage. Outside. This one means inside. So as you look at this rib cage, there'll be muscles on the outside and muscles on the inside. They look like the same picture, but really this one sits on top of it like a cake, like layers in a cake. This one is on top of that one. That's why it's called external. If you were dissecting or putting a needle through a human being, the first thing you would penetrate through, if you put that needle through, is the external intercostals. And then finally, it would go through and then go to the internal intercostals. And they elevate and depress the rib cage. The external one, let the E remind you for elevate. Let the internal let you remind you for the opposite, depresses. And so typically on a lot of these diagrams, they're depicted in this manner, is that you'll see the inside of one and then the directions of the fibers slightly are different. And so in this case, I can see from both, let me just double check, yes, that if you look at the fibers here on the outside, you can see that this fibers go in this direction. I've done my best to draw them in. And for the internal ones, they are going in an opposite direction. And let me switch colors actually here. Yes. And so they sit right on top of each other. So the way they show is they show external first and then internal. And so that's why my notes just say intercostals, because I wouldn't ask you like this. Where it really matters for you to find it is on the model. And so you can see that the external intercostals, the fibers go in this direction. And the internal intercostals, they go in the opposite direction. You must look at the lines on it. And so the ones that go in that direction make up the internal intercostal. And you can see that they're through the entire rib cage. This is external. And then internal, they all go in the opposite direction. Opposite direction. And so those are going to be your internal intercostals. But in actuality, there would be all of this would be all the way over here and on top of it. But the model removes it so that you can see the ones that are underneath. And the external elevates, internal depresses. Here's from a little more zoomed out. You can see your external ones, and then you can also see your internal ones. And this is actually incorrect. Actually, as I look at this, this is not internal. This is external, more external. Yeah, they didn't show the right segment on this part. All right, and we move on. Yeah, this is a different model. They didn't show the proper segment. I see why they were trying to do that, but that's wrong. And so with that, we look at our next diagram here, and then we have our rectus abdominis. This is what we know as the six-pack. And rectus, meaning it goes upwards in a way like that. Erect, that's kind of where the word means. Sort of means to be sort of perpendicular, honestly. But this, in this case, rect. And the abdominis for abdominal region. And this is the reason you can flex your vertebral column, or that means to touch your toes. That's what flexing your vertebral column means. And then we have the obliques, one on the outside, one on the inside. The external oblique is going to be on the outside. You can see that they had to cut off a complete layer of this so that you can see the internal one. And the internal one's going to be underneath that external one. And the good news is that all these muscles, rectus abdominis, external obliques, and internal obliques, they all flex the vertebral column. So technically you can learn flexes the vertebral column for all of them, and you'll be pretty safe on the exam. And transverse abdominis, this is a little bit different. This allows for compression of the abdominal contents. What this means that if I was about to punch you in the stomach, what do you do with your stomach? You like tighten it up. That's what this does. Transversus abdominis tightens up your stomach or compresses your abdomen. And as an FYI, they all technically can compress. And the obliques and rectus abdominis, they allow for rotation as well. Like that means to do this sort of like look side to side off your belly button, to just do this, rotate. And so that's their ability to. So you can remember either one of those functions going into the exam. And make sure to look at this model. Your rectus lines go up, the oblique ones go at an oblique angle, the external one will be the first one on top, internal will be underneath, and transverses will go at an angle, at a transverse plane. That's why they're called transversus abdominis. But external's on top, then internal, then transversus. It goes in that order. And rectus abdominis is only in the middle. Remember that, in the middle. Next, as we make our way to the arm, we have our biceps brachii. This is the one that we just call the biceps normally in our day-to-day speak. And so we have this is going to be responsible for flexing the elbow joint, meaning flexing the forearm. In other words, bending this wrist, just bending, flexing at the beach. And then this other muscle assists with the same thing as the biceps brachii. It's called brachioradialis. It starts in the brachial region, and then it goes to your radial region, your radius bone, and so you can even see that's the case. It originates up here, and then travels down to that radius bone. And they both flex the forearm, or they flex the elbow. It kind of means the same thing. Tricep, now if you look at this half, this is the back of the body now, posterior view. And so triceps brachii is going to be a muscle that you encounter on the posterior portion, opposite of the biceps, and it does the opposite. It does extension of that elbow joint, meaning that it straightens out your limb. And you can even see it's connected to that ulna to allow that swivel action around the trochlea. That trochlear notch swivels around the trochlea. This is a picture of the muscle in the models. Find your biceps. This is going to be on the anterior, the same way it is on yours. Think about your hand, where your bicep is, compare it to the model. And it's going to be the same concept in the back tricep. And then this is the only unique one because it originates in the brachial region. It originates here. And then it makes its way to the thumb side. Remember that your thumb is your radius side. And so you can see the brachioradialis is going to be just this little segment here, which is called your brachioradialis. As we move on to the forearm, you'll see that we have our muscles that are going to be involved in the actual pronation process, like flipping a pancake, and it's called pronator teres, pronates the forearm. And then my favorite part about these muscles is that they become harder. Once you learn the names, it becomes easy to learn them, but at first it looks terrifying. But the best part is that you know enough background to understand what they do already. Half the work is done. For example, flexor, we understand what flexion means of the arm. That flexion means to curl your fingers in, and flexing the wrist means to curl your wrist in. And so you can see in the name it's telling you that. Flexes, carpi is a play off of the word carpal, which means wrist. And so this is telling you the action. Flexes the wrist, and that's the action. Next one. This one does the same thing. Flexes the digitorum, superficialis. So what does that mean? What does the digits represent? The fingers. And so this flexes the fingers. And in this case, it flexes the digitorum. In this case, it flexes one finger. I'm going to put one finger. And so flexes one finger, and you can see middle phalanges. And actually, let's look at this very carefully. No, let's leave it simple. Sorry, I misspoke. Fingers, pardon. There we go. But again, you only need to know one. And flexes digits is good enough. Flexes phalanges. See, that's enough to keep you safe on the exam. Let this word remind you of that. This superficialis is telling you this because there's another muscle called flexor digitorum, but it's underneath it. So it's called brevis to imply deeper. But you don't need that one. So superficialis. Next one. Now, the opposite is true. This is the front. Now, if we look at the back, they share the same pattern of naming. That even though it's a brand new muscle, the extensor digitorum is going to extend digits. So extend fingers. That'll keep you safe on the exam. You could technically write extends wrist, but I think it's easier. Extend digits. Next, we have flexor carpi ulnaris. It flexes the wrist. That's the action, right? That was on the other side. Flexor carpi ulnaris flexes wrist. If we look at the opposite, extensor carpi ulnaris, on the opposite side of the forearm, this is technically anterior, but it kind of goes off to the side. That's why they're showing it to you. But also to help you remember this, extensor carpi extends the wrist, extends the carpal region. And you know that the ulna is on your pinky side. Therefore, you know that it's going to, all of these muscles, ulnaris is going to be on the pinky side. And you can even see that's the case here. Ulnaris on pinky side. Pinky side. and they are labeled here for you. Extensor digitorum, you're going to see it's going to have all of these tendons, all of these white things that go and connect to the fingers, to the bones. And then when you want to extend your digits, they pull on those tendons in that direction, and the fingers straighten out like this. Straighten out. Straighten out. And this is the front of the hand, the palm. And these muscles, you can see that they're all going to be linked to either the carpal region, or they're going to be linked to the digits. And then they're going to be flexing the digits. But if they're linked to this, they flex the wrist, and that's why it's called flexor carpi ulnaris. Same muscles, different view. Learn it on these pictures. You should be able to find it on our models. And then to finish up, we only have our thigh and our calf region. And so with that, here on this portion, you really want to focus on this ribbon-like muscle called sartorius. It's going to do flexion of that thigh. And what flexion of the thigh is, it's elevation of that thigh. I'll show you on the camera here. Let me connect up. That as you look at the person's thigh, look at, oops, when you look at this region here, when you look at the thigh, when you flex the thigh, it says, remember how this was flexion of the arm? It was going up with the arms. This is the same thing. This is going to be, abduction of your leg, and then, flexion of your thigh. See how I'm flexing the thigh? It's flexing straight up. And then when I extend it, it's back down, and to hyperextend all the way to the back. And so when you come to the center now, it's the same thing kind of with the jumping jack. This was flexion of the arm. This was abduction of the arm. And so it's the same concept here. This is flexion of the thigh. Thigh is flexing. And then this is, when you go back down, this is also abduction, A-B-D. And then going back down, adduction. And so it's the same thing as a jumping jack. Never forget, when you do the up part of a jumping jack, you're doing abduction at both parts. The limb is abducting, this is abducting. And then when you adduct, bringing them back together. You're adding it to your body. That's the way I like to think about it too, A-D-D. Adding it, bringing it together. But do not forget that flexion is forward, extension back, abduction and adduction. That's really the tough part about those motions, because they look the same. And now that I'm standing, I might as well do these now too. That you can do the same motions that you did up here on the elbow. Flexion, extension. Flexion, extension. And then the wrist too. Flexion, extension. Fingers too. Extension, flexion. And so the legs can do that same thing, right? Flexion of the thigh, flexion of the knee would look like this. Flexion, to bend that knee. And then extension of it is to bring it back down. Extension. The foot can do two types of flexion. Might as well see it in action. Here you're going upwards is going to be dorsiflexion, letting go of the gas. Plantar flexion, going towards your plantar region, is to press on that gas. Plantar flexion. So you can see, just like the upper limb, you had joint here, joint here, joint here, and the fingers. And then up here's the same thing. The thigh, elbow, tarsal instead of the carpal region, the ankle, and then the toes, right? Even the toes, if you flex your toes, what does that look like right now if your toes are like this? What does it look like? It's curling your toes, and then uncurling your toes, extension. And so that's the general premise behind those motions. So as we go into them. Now, when you look at these muscles here, the first we're going to start at the top. Thigh flexion, or elevating that thigh that we just saw, in the way that we just saw, was iliacus, because it sits on your ilium bone. That's one of the easy ones to find. You find your ilium bone, you found your iliacus, thigh flexion. Sartorius connects to that edge there of that iliac spine, and it connects to all the way to this crural area, the area that we know as the shin. That ribbon-like muscle is called sartorius, and it also, good news, flexes the thigh. It does a few other actions like abduction of that thigh, but otherwise flexes thigh I think is pretty safe because it's the same thing as iliacus, so you can pair them together. Next, we have our muscles that are going to be involved in adduction. It's in the name. See, it says adducts thigh. Means that it brings the leg into the middle of your body. You're bringing it back after a jumping jack. Adductor, A-D-D. And so adductor longus is going to be between the thigh, and it's going to be responsible for adduction. Next, in that same right underneath it or next to it, medial to it, you have another one that does the same thing, adducts the leg. And that's the good news about these muscles is that the ones in the middle are underneath the midline. You can see here's our sacrum bone. Underneath the midline, these are all going to adduct. Easy peasy. You compare these two together. You compare iliacus and sartorius together for flexing the thigh. Now these you compare together, these three, because they do the same thing. Extends leg, extends leg, extends leg. So you can see vastus lateralis, it's lateral, so it's on the side. The other one's called vastus medialis because it's in the middle. So lateralis, medialis, but they start with vastus for the same because they're in the same area. And then rectus femoris is right between both of them. And rectus again means like upwards, right? And then femoris, this is the femur bone, so rectus femoris. So you're seeing three muscles, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. These are the three muscles of the quads. You never heard the quadriceps? This is the three muscles that make up the three of the four muscles that make up the quadriceps. The other one is underneath here, and it's called vastus intermedius, just like this, vastus intermedius. But otherwise, they all extend the leg. So that's the good news. You learn the name. You only need to learn 3 actions because you can group them together. And this is the vastus intermedius. And so on our model, let me finish this model, and then we'll talk about it on the model. And then on the back end of this thigh, you have your gluteus maximus, which is the large, what we normally call the butt muscle. And then the gluteus medius sits underneath it. It's just this tiny muscle underneath. Next, you have your bicep femoris, and it's going to be on the femoral. It's going to be on the other side. Remember what the biceps do for the arm? They flex at the beach, right? They flex the elbow. So the bicep means that there's going to be some flexing. So it flexes the knee. So I don't know, that might be a little bit helpful for some of you. And I like flexion of the knee for this segment because all the ones that we're about to do the same thing. So you compare them together. So they're all right next door, so they all do the same thing. Bicep femoris, semitendinosus, semimembranosus, they all flex the knee. And again, that just means to bend the knee, to bend it. If you look at it with an actual model, it's very simple to find your kneecap. Then you can find 3 muscles right away. You have your rectus femoris, you have your vastus lateralis, it's going to be lateral on your pinky toe side, and then medialis, which is going to be on top of your tibia or your big toe. And so that's vastus medialis. And underneath rectus femoris, if it's removed, you would be able to see vastus intermedius. This one, vastus intermedius. You have your sartorius, which again is that ribbon-like one. And then you have the adductors, adductor longus and gracilis, that sit in the middle of the thigh, bringing the leg down after that jumping jack. And then iliacus is like sitting inside of the bowl of the ilium in a way, and it's just laid out there for you to see, iliacus. It's the highest muscle you will need on our exam for the leg. Gluteus maximus, you can see the large butt muscle. These muscles, you just have to go in order. Start from the lateral side, the pinky toe side of your foot. Go to your thigh, or the thigh of the models that you see of the leg part, and all the way back there. If you see it, this model will have the furthest one that's most lateral is going to be bicep femoris. Make your way to the second one. That's going to be semitendinosus. It even has this huge tendon there to remind you of the name, semitendinosus. It has a huge tendon. That white is tendon. The rest of it is muscle, skeletal muscle tissue. And then you have underneath that semitendinosus, you have semimembranosus, which sounds very eerily similar, but membranosus. And that's just going to sit right underneath it. It's a little tough to make out because it has 2 segments. That's one segment. They're just together, but the semitendinosus I just mentioned kind of comes in and just sits on top of the actual semimembranosus. So you can't even see the membranosus that well because this one's sort of coming in and getting in the way. And that's why you're seeing the brackets like this. You're seeing this little arrow and this little arrow. And it's worth looking at the models before you come into the exam. So this is what it looks like. You can see the semitendinosus is this obnoxious muscle that is right next to the bicep femoris, but as you trace it down, trace, you'll see that another muscle sits right underneath it. And it even is a little bit on this side too. But again, this muscle just comes in and cuts it off. It's something you have to see visually, physically in the model. And then gluteus medius. When you remove the gluteus maximus, you can see that it could be removed. There's this little pin here. If I remove it, you can see gluteus medius. You can even see it, a little piece of it on the top there. And so that's that same muscle that we're seeing here. They removed it from that pin. They took it off. They removed the entire gluteus maximus, and you can see the medius. It's like saying medium gluteus muscle because it's like mid-sized gluteus medius. And then to finish up, we have our calf. We have our gastrocnemius. This is what is called plantar flexion, meaning that it actually makes your foot. Oh, this is a. No, this is correct. Sorry. Plantar flexion is like pressing the gas, like we described when you're driving. You press down on the gas, or tippy toe. When you work out your calves, right? Like you want to elevate something with your calves, you do a lot of calf raises. In anatomy, the calf is known as the gastrocnemius. And it's called this because it has like two segments to it, and those segments are jokingly called bellies. And so it's like saying belly, group of bellies. And so gastrocnemius, that's the calf muscle. It's responsible for tippy toeing or again, plantar flexion. There's a muscle on the fibula called the fibularis longus, and it assists with that very motion as well, plantar flexion. The tibialis anterior, this is going to sit in the front of the tibia. That's why it's called that. And it's going to be involved in the opposite action of plantar flexion. And I should be a little bit easier to explain this. These gastrocnemius, this is on the technically visualized more from the back. You can see the calf muscle from the anterior side, but you'll see that they're even pointing to it on the lateral side of the foot, and on the back you can really see it because it's those two bellies that you see. That's your calf muscle. But again, it's visual. If it's large enough, it's visual from the front. And so the tibialis anterior, however, only sits on the anterior side. You can't see it from the back of the foot, the back of the leg, see? And so it sits in front of the tibia, and it's involved in the opposite action of plantar flexion, dorsiflexion. And then our fibularis longus, recall that our fibula is going to be on the lateral side. And so as you look at this bone, at the bones on this side from the lateral view, the fibula will always be on your pinky toe side. And therefore, you can even see it's labeled twice there. It's labeled here because it's very lateral, and you can see it from the front just a little bit, but really it's more of a lateral muscle above anything else. Next, when you remove our gastrocnemius, if you were to slip it off, like you can do this with our actual model, and you take it off, or you don't even have to take it off, if you just follow the tendon, there's this long tendon that goes down, and is famous for being named after a Greek hero. Does anybody know what that tendon's called? Achilles tendon. The Achilles heel, right? And the Achilles tendon is connected all the way down here. If you follow it down, you'll see that if you sort of remove it, underneath it, this segment is your soleus, underneath that tendon. And so that's our soleus. And the good news is it helps out the gastrocnemius with plantar flexion. So a lot of this is first IDing and then grouping your muscles. And for the next extra credit activity I want us to have is I want us to actually create a table. I'm going to have a table with the terms, and you're just going to be matching the actions so you can see how easy you can group them together, and the memorization can be easier process. And that'll be our extra credit for the week, next week. And so here now, leg muscles. This is the same muscles that we're seeing, labeled for you. And then we'll make sure to do the due diligence of checking soleus and gastrocnemius. Soleus sits underneath the gastrocnemius, and tibialis anterior sits in front of the tibia. Here's the tibialis anterior, and then your tibia bone is underneath it. And then fibularis longus is going to be on the fibula side, which is going to be on the pinky toe side, lateral side, the lateral side. These are all the muscles that you need to know at a glance from the anterior and the posterior. I made this so that we can simplify it, and then maybe we can group it with